Hello, everybody. My name is Mirko Novakovic. I am co-founder and CEO of Dash0, and welcome to Code Red. Code, because we are talking about code, and Red stands for requests, errors, and duration, the core metrics of observability. On this podcast, you will hear from leaders around our industry about what they are building, what's next in observability, and what you can do today to avoid your next outage. Today, my guest is Ben Blackmore, our CTO and co-founder at Dash0. Ben and I go back a long time. We worked together at CodeCentric, then at Instana, now at Dash0. Hi, Ben.
Hey, Mirko. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and also for you, my first question, what was your best Code Red moment or worst?
Yeah, I mean, we did have quite a few also at Instana from in the early days, like most of our servers accidentally terminating. That was a very fun one. But one for here, a really good one was, we had it rather in like maybe year 3 or 4 at Instana with website monitoring. So we had this script tag, right, that customers could embed on their websites. And they were so loading a piece of JavaScript, and they were also sending us data through that. As it is in a startup, you start with something simple. And what happened is we had eventually quite a few customers using that. And the ingress point that we had, which was basically just 2 small Nginx instances, got a bit overloaded. And the super interesting thing with that one was, from a technical perspective, it was not a very complicated problem that occurred. So these Nginx instances got overloaded. There we needed to tweak the configuration, whatever. But what was really interesting is the impact of that, because customers were loading the script from our servers. This actually impacted their websites. So we had quite a few also e-commerce sites, right? And so their websites got slower, which is, of course, absolutely terrible, right? That's the last thing you want to do. You don't want to impact your customers. And so that was a bit scary, seeing that happen, us seeing relatively clearly what we have to do, but also not having a really good way to test this, right? Because, I mean, you don't really have 3 other Nginx instances lying around with that amount of traffic. So, yeah. What did we have to do? Go in, manually changing the config, reloading it, hoping for the best. And then also interesting is, well, if you have an Nginx, which is a really, really good piece of tech, and you are reloading the configuration under a really high amount of load, that's a bit scary, right? If you have this piece of software that normally is like responding instantly and only needs a few megabytes of RAM, and suddenly it gets stuck on startup a bit for a moment, you're like, oh shit. Oh shit. Yeah, and that one was just really interesting, right? Because you have on one side, you have this technical complexity of the incident, and on the other side, you have what is the impact that it's producing. And that one was like relatively low complexity, but super high impact. In that moment, we really had to solve it at that point, because like end user traffic is highly seasonal. So we didn't really hit that evening spike yet. And we were really afraid of, hey, what is going to happen at the peak, right? Is just everything falling over? Yeah, so we acted. We didn't really have really good metrics on it, because we had the free version of Nginx, which has like 5 metrics that are not really telling you anything. The paid version comes with a lot more, but I mean, we were a startup, right? So didn't want to pay 6,000 a year just for like a few additional metrics. Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting one.
Yeah, I can imagine. And talking about this, right, RAM and these things, I mean, I was talking to customers recently a lot, enterprise level SMBs, and then I talked to you because you are a very experienced web developer. And for me, it was kind of weird that what I'm hearing from customers is that they have an observability stack, and you think all the developers are using it, but then you figure out that actually the web developers have a total different stack. They use more tools like stuff like Sentry and other things for error tracking and some sort of run, session recording things. So you explained to me, but explain it to me again. Why are web developers not normal developers, and why are they using different tools, and why are they thinking differently of code than the rest?
There's probably a variety of reasons for it, and I'm probably overgeneralizing now. But I think in large parts, web developers care about errors, right? This is the thing they really care about. And when I say web developers, I mean people just writing JavaScript for most of the day, the stuff that is running in the browser. Many are just consuming APIs, so they are not necessarily the ones responsible for it. Of course, that depends on the organization. And so with performance, not that often a problem, at least not from a RAM perspective, that you need RAM for this, or whether you call it RAM or UM, right? All the same. I think just the most important signal to them is there must not be a bug in it, right? It should not be exploding in my customer's face. So I think they just have less of a need for tracing rather often, or they think they have less of a need for it, right? We see that a lot also internally, right? Once you show people the value of tracing, for those that are using it for the first time, right? This is really incredible. If they have the need for that, and if they need it to debug and troubleshoot what they are responsible for.
Yeah, I was also thinking about it a bit, and I came up, and maybe I'm totally wrong. That's why I would tell you my theory, and then you tell me if that makes any sense. But in the server landscape, you have a lot of concurrency problems, right? It's about load, concurrency, calling, distribution, where in the browser, essentially the code is executed on the client of each individual user, right? So you have actually a lot of power, and it's not a concurrency issue in a sense. And so if you debug or analyze performance problems, you don't have to do that under load. You can essentially do it in your browser, and the browsers now have pretty good support for performance analysis. You kind of have tracing in the browser, right? Which shows you how things are executed. I'm assuming because of that, it's much easier for a web developer to troubleshoot that, because they don't need actually the production data for looking at performance. They can just take the browser developer tools, analyze it in the browser. So it works on my PC basically, right? Optimize it, roll it out, and then the other problem you described are errors, and errors can be very different, right? Because it can depend on the browser type, on the version, on the operating system, so that you can't reproduce on your own PC. But does it make sense?
No, it absolutely makes sense, because in the end, what a web developer often wants to know is, what is the path taken to the problem, right? What are the steps? Where did the user, maybe what did they click on? Like, did this happen immediately, or maybe like 5 minutes, 10 minutes afterwards? And all of that is often a lot easier to reproduce, right, in the web browser. And it's also a somewhat luxurious position when you compare that to a backend developer, platform developer, because also end users can just refresh the page. They can restart the application essentially, right? The backend developer can't do that. I totally agree, right? The problem dimensions and how you're troubleshooting them is very different. And if you look at some of the solutions out there that are within the error monitoring space, it's a lot about the path to the problem. So it's the problem itself, but also the path taken to it, so that you have an idea of what happened and in what context did it happen.
Yeah, and the stack trace, right? Getting the context of the error and stuff like that, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I still believe that it would make sense that you have everything in one context, right? Because at the end of the day, it's one system. Yes, I get the point that it's running the browser, I can reload it and all these things. But at the end, I have an end-to-end system, and probably the browser is calling my APIs, multiple of them. And then sometimes that is an issue. And I don't know if that's a network latency or actually a problem of that API responding, and having end-to-end traces makes sense. I do get that it's a different set of problems, but I still think it makes sense to build it into one tool.
And it absolutely makes sense, especially when developers take more ownership of what they're responsible for, right? If your responsibility fully ends within the web browser, then of course what you're looking at is different. But if you're really responsible for that subsystem, for that service, whatever you might call it, right, then you need a lot more context, and then you are also interested in solving that more holistically. Maybe let's call that, right? And then you need that data, and then you will want to know exactly what has happened. Yeah, I always find that interesting, right? When you show people the tracing data, some people that are not really, they don't know what the API is doing behind the scenes, like what is the service doing behind the scenes, and then you give them like some understanding of it, right? Then they see, oh yeah, okay, so it's making some database calls, they're taking that long, maybe they see the SQL statement. It also gives them a lot better understanding of the system as a whole and what is going on, and an appreciation for the other side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And help us a little bit understand how OpenTelemetry works here, right? We know that there are the three signals: spans, logs, metrics, but there's also now a standardization around end user monitoring. And I know we call that beacons, right? When we send it, I'm not sure if there's a new word here, if it's reusing existing OTel things. So how does it work? Why do I need a different concept? What's the state of it? Give us a little bit of background on that.
So yes, the signals, metrics, logs, traces. In the OpenTelemetry world, you have essentially the JavaScript distribution, OpenTelemetry.js, which has, broadly speaking, two modes that it can operate in, one within a Node.js context, the other within a browser. And so there's like slightly two different compilations, essentially, of that thing. And you could run the OpenTelemetry.js variant for the web browser to essentially collect logs and spans. In theory, you could also gather metrics, but it has a little bit of funkiness associated to it. So not many people are really doing that. And so the majority of people, if anything, they would be collecting spans and logs. And you can do that, right? There's guidelines on the OpenTelemetry website to do that, to set it up, which, you import it as a library, configure it somewhat normal, and then you can use it to generate that telemetry. That works somewhat normal. There is, however, a lot of discussion still around exactly what should be the data format for RAM data. So right now, the majority of it is actually spans in a variety of formats, whatever the trace boundaries are, right? There's a lot of discussion around it. There are some OTEPs, so OpenTelemetry enhancement proposals out there on exactly the format, whether some of that should be converted to log events. A lot of internals that to the end user hopefully shouldn't matter. But there's still a lot of discussion around it because end user data and website monitoring data is often rather long-lived, like one session, if you think about a session, or a page load, like where does the trace start and end? There's a lot of bike shedding around this, right? You can have a whole lot of perspectives on it. And also there's a whole lot of activity which is rather instantaneous. And this is where a lot of the discussion is coming from. Is it an hour span? Is it a log? Whatever it is. We actually at Instana originally had this as traces as well. So all of the website monitoring we did, everything we did was essentially spans. We came up with some trace boundaries for it that we thought were reasonable. But I think within a year, we came to the realization that actually, while we can use traces for it, it doesn't really make too much sense because the structure is often completely shallow, right? You don't have any depth within that trace in the majority of cases. You have like, oh, a page is loaded. Oh, there's like one request, and then there's nothing nested underneath it. So we realized, hey, we're not needing this. And also, it is creating some problems within the trace processing pipeline. So we essentially ditched that and we're like, okay, we can simplify this a lot. We can make the protocol more efficient and stuff like that. And there have been similar discussions on the OpenTelemetry side as well. There's like a super huge issue on GitHub with like, hey, should we rethink this? Should this be a different signal? I think in the end, it doesn't really matter that much what signal it is, as long as it is consistent. And that is still a journey that OpenTelemetry is on. Right? They're still finding it out. It's still experimental. I think it's also still marked as experimental on the OTel website because it is somewhat diverging from the spec. Not everything is figured out. Also some fundamentals, but they're working towards that. There's some rather good wrappers around it as well. We are also thinking about what to do there exactly, right? And also what that means for OpenTelemetry native, which is something that we care about a lot. What does it mean to be OpenTelemetry native with RUM at this current point in time?
I think first of all, it's good that OpenTelemetry is going into that direction, right? And RUM is essential for observability in my point of view. Actually, I like RUM a lot, right? Because it's actually looking at the end user, right?
Yeah, impact, right?
Exactly. So I think it's very important. And I agree with you. At the end of the day, the end user will not care if it's a log or a span or an event or some new type of signal, call it beacon. Doesn't really matter. It is more or less a technical issue, right? Which will be solved. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So we are working on that whole RUM web observability experience at the moment. Yeah, I'm kind of excited about it when we release it. Also having this OTel native and also an experience for a web developer that should be seamless and make sure that it solved the use case that we described that are different for a web developer, but there are also a lot of reasons why it should be end to end, right? So I'm really looking forward, including this whole session replay thing and understanding sessions and funnels, and it's such a interesting and exciting topic.
Yeah, it also enables, I think, the other side, right? We talk now about the front-end developers or web developers, but if you're a back-end developer and you can see what the true origin of it is, like what user is it, or what organization, customer, account, whatever you call it, is responsible for that, and you can say, oh, like 30% of the load is coming from this one account that we have. That is also super helpful for everybody else working on the other side, right? So it's a win-win all around.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And as you know, I'm a big believer in dog fooding. We know that we also need it, right? Because we are also pretty strong on the client side, right? We are using JavaScript in the browser. We are using Vercel as a platform, right?
Yep.
We also released Dash0 and the Vercel marketplace recently, so to make it really easy. And I can see why this also makes total sense in that environment, right? Having a full RAM experience for Vercel and this whole edge computing style of programming.
Exactly. We are using OpenTelemetry.js internally for ourselves, and our web developers are also missing things, right? They're like, hey, I would like to have this in a better way, the way stack traces are presented, how we are post-processing them, session recording maybe, right? They also have needs, and ideally, they just use Dash0 for that as well, and we're on the road to that.
Yeah. And just touching it shortly, right? But because that could be a whole podcast, but what we are hearing also from customers, and we also discuss it internally, RAM is one topic, but then you have product analytics, which is a total different category. But if you think about it, product analytics is also a lot around session recording, analyzing sessions, understanding what users are doing, what they are clicking, which functions they are using. It's probably a little bit more analytical at one point, right? Where you want to have more statistical and a suggestion what users are doing, what they are not doing. But I think there's also an opportunity for consolidation here because it's essentially the same data.
It absolutely is the same data. And funny enough, whenever we had a need for any kind of analytics integration, the first thing that we always built is a wrapper around these APIs, because the assumption was there's a very high likelihood that this tool will change. So you write a wrapper around it because the API surface area of these tools is always the same, right? It's like there's an event name, there's some metadata you send out, and there's some initialization function that's slightly different. But in the end, it's always the same, right? If you think about how that relates to a lock event or a span, it's very, very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let's move to another topic that I'm excited about. I also can't digest it totally. I think nobody at the moment really can, to be honest.
Okay, I know what's coming. I mean, it must be AI.
It must be AI, exactly. So let's talk about AI. First of all, I can explain a little bit how we think about AI, right? At the moment, we are not so much, I think we agree on that, around chatbots or conversational AI at all, right? Using natural language for querying. It's just, we don't believe that that's actually making you more productive. We think of AI more as a very integrated thing in the product and building a product for that or based on that. I like the comparison with Apple Photos, right? In Apple Photos, you can search for dog and it will show you dogs. If there's text in the photo, you can just magically mark and copy it. So that's AI, but you don't even see that it's AI, right? And our first feature is pretty similar, right? Log AI for us, you send in an unstructured log, and essentially what we do, we learn the structure, we extract the structure, so we extract the fields, like the status, like in a log, could be, is it an error or debug? And we do that, and then we make the unstructured log structured, which makes it much easier than to search, to digest, to filter, to understand problems, to figure out problems, because if you don't know that something is an error, you wouldn't alert on it. So that's the first thing we have built. Tell us a little bit about how that works, how we use LLMs there, and especially how do we use that in production, right? Because I think one of the things I've learned now is there's this whole idea of AI and using Python and creating something, an algorithm. But then if you have billions of logs in production, you have to apply it somehow, right?
That is the real challenge often. At least in our experience, we have been there in the past, right? We have had several AI things also back at Instana that never made it to production because we couldn't figure out how to get this to production. And that was something we're trying to do very differently now with the things we came up with. Is immediately it was always the question of, okay, there's this model, whatever it is, whether it's something in a Python library or it's an LLM or something, and how can we make this work at scale? That was always the immediate question, and trying to figure that out.
And especially from a cost perspective, also, right? It was always like, if it costs $5 per log, who would pay for it?
Exactly. And I'm actually super afraid of some of the stuff right now. Is we have this stuff running, and I mean, we need to make sure that cost is not exploding as well, right? The immediate things we have done, like at the very beginning with Log AI, is you do the super low-hanging fruit, which is to copy it into ChatGPT, and you ask it, hey, what is this thing? And of course, an LLM is pretty good at recognizing standardized log formats, right? There's so many examples of that on the web that, of course, they can do that. But the problem is you can't invoke ChatGPT for 300,000 log records a second or 1,000,000 log records a second. That just doesn't work, right? So you need to come up with a solution. And the solution is not smaller model. The solution is more than that. It's like, what can we do to get a similar experience to get this, but at a teeny tiny fraction of the cost, right? In comparison. That was actually quite the struggle, also hiring for that role, right? This is also what you've just mentioned, is like finding a person that exactly fits this skill set, right? Which was a different dimension to that. Because what we have learned is you can hire data scientists, to oversimplify that a bit, right? That are really good at maybe coming up with a solution, with trying different algorithms. They know math in and out, but they don't have the necessary software engineering background to get this to production. On the pragmatic engineer, they actually have a really good guest article, I think it was, on exactly the different machine learning and AI roles. And that basically what a lot of people want is essentially a team, right? There's like 5 or 6 different roles, and what you're asking for is a whole team. And so, of course, for us, that is, as a small company, also not feasible. So we were trying to figure out, what can we really do? How can we hire to make this work? And how can we find this middle ground between, you have this whole theoretical background, but you also have software engineering skills. And so what depth do we need in what area? And that actually took quite some time to figure this out, right? How does it match our strategy, what we want to do, the rough idea we have in mind? How can we test for this? That was pretty hard.
There's a word in German for that thing, but I don't know in English. Eierlegende Wollmilchsau.
Oh, yeah.
One of
Yes.
those complicated German words. It's basically something or someone who knows everything, right? From math and computer science to bring something in production, right? Had a wide spectrum. That's kind of the person you're searching for. And we search for, but we basically figure out that's very hard to find, right?
Incredibly hard, yes.
We were lucky. We found with Larry, we got amazingly luck with someone who has experience in both. And we are adding some engineering skills to it to support this going into production. But I think it's very interesting to hear, right, that there is this whole computer science thing, but then bringing that into production. So how did we do that?
I mean, in the end, we are using an LLM for this, right? But essentially, we're just using it to give us hints, to come up with like hints how to interpret these logs. And then everything around it is basically a custom model to figure out, okay, like this is the very first hint we have gotten. How can we apply this to future log records to interpret them? And then figuring out, if we have those hints now our resource centricity comes into play, because how can we apply what we have learned to the same resource or to similar resources, so that we avoid re-identification of, let's broadly speaking, the log format, right? Because we want to remember that. We want to remember this across restarts. But at the same time, we also want to know, does the log record change, right? There are some nasty things that can happen, although that is really uncommon. But the more common thing is log records change at startup time, right? There's often a log record, which is where the logger is not fully initialized. That is more common. So you have like a few log records that are not fitting your expectation. That is a pretty interesting one. And you also don't want to lose those, right? Because the very 4 or 5, they can sometimes be really interesting
Very
if the
interesting. Yeah.
process is crashing, right? You are like, you want to know those as well. So that has been a pretty interesting journey, and it actually combines a lot of the pieces we have within Dash0 in order to make this possible and in order to make this work efficiently at the end of the day.
The problem is always in the details, right? The things you figure out. And then one question is, I mean, we know that there are hallucinations, right? I mean, one of the things we discussed also is when you, for example, let's take the severity of a log, right? And you say, oh, it's an error. It would be pretty bad, in my point of view, if you would categorize something as an error, which turns out to not be an error, right? So how do we make sure that this false positive rate is essentially zero, right? Is that possible at all? And if yes, how do we do that?
I think there's always the chance that this can happen, right? So we can only reduce the likelihood of this happening. If you just naively throw it into an LLM and take whatever it's giving you, there's a chance that this is actually pretty wrong. So a lot of the work went into double checking what the output is, sanity checking it against a lot of rules around potential formats and structures. If it is able to extract a severity, what can this be? What does it make sense? What is the overall sentiment of the log record? To just make sure, okay, yeah, this actually is very likely a problem, right? This is not just an informational thing. So that this is what we have been working towards, is using an LLM, which is, I mean, purely statistical, and also observability knowledge, and being like, okay, we know this should look roughly like that. Do these two things overlap? Like, does it match what we would expect? So that's what we have been working towards with this approach here.
It's interesting sentiment. So you basically say you categorize something in error, and then you look at the message and ask, what is the sentiment, right? And if the message says something, blah, blah, blah is broken, the sentiment is probably more word towards error. If it says, oh, this looks fine, the sentiment is maybe too positive for an error, and that you would use that as a categorization or like as a cross check.
To be fair, there for this dimension, we're still at the beginning. But I mean, this is one form of validation, right? Is you throw it into an LLM and you need to figure out, can you trust the output? And I mean, you could ask another LLM to evaluate the output of the first, but this eventually gets also pretty expensive.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting. I love the first feature that we released. We are working on other things, right? Like grouping things, like pattern detection, like reducing the size of traces, right, to better digest them. So what are you mostly excited about?
So I'm super excited about the log capability, not the severity identification, but the next step, which would be extracting a lot more attributes and name fields out of these logs. Because then at this point, you will really be properly able to filter. Because what's the alternative that's currently existing in the market is either you parse everything up front and you need to get it right, which is absolutely horror, or you parse it at query time by reading all the logs, piping them through some kind of parsing step in memory. Great. Right. And then doing this while you have an incident. This is not the nicest experience, right? You don't want to deal with parsing and regular expressions while shit is hitting the fan, literally. So that is something that I'm really excited about. And also showing what we're actually doing, right? One of the learnings now was this whole Apple mantra is really nice. But the problem is, if it is so behind the scenes, nobody sees it. That's also quite the struggle then, right? How do you show what you have done if it is just means there's better data?
No, absolutely. Yes. And we are working on that, right? Especially interesting also from, I mean, I'm more on the go-to-market side from a sales perspective, right? Because it's very hard to say, look, we have this cool lock ad feature, and then somebody says, okay, show me. And you're like, yeah, it's in here, right? The
Data
data
is
looks
better.
the data is better, right? Exactly. So that's something that's hard to sell, even though it makes a ton of sense, but it's hard to show, right? Especially on a demo, or customers see that if you turn it on, because then they have much better data. But if you don't have this moment, this is the old data, this is new data, then it's very hard to show that.
Yeah. And we did have that at the very beginning. It was pretty easy, right? With our, was it still beta customers at that time? I think so, right? When we were like, hey, so we enabled this experimental feature for you. Like, here's your before, here's the after. What do you think? And I mean, the first sentiment was, of course, I mean, this is awesome. I didn't have to do anything. And I now see more, get more information out of my data. Cool. But now, especially those that are just starting, that is a different story.
Yeah. And now I have a more personal question for you. We didn't discuss that upfront, but let's figure that out. Because, I mean, we discussed a lot of interesting technical challenges, right? If you build an observability tool, there's so many technical challenges, right? It's like from the user perspective, it's scale, it's performance, load of data, right? You have to process, store, do that as cheap as possible. This is your first CTO role. And I know that you are on the technical side, you are really good. But we discussed today, you told me we had another call and you said, hey, during the day, I'm now doing this manager work. And then in the evenings and on the weekend, or if I have time, I relax by programming things, right? So
Yes.
now tell me about that. What does that mean? So programming is now your free time, essentially, and you love it and it's relaxing. And then how is that transition working for somebody who used to be a really good engineer, now is CTO, already has a team of probably more than 20 people and managing people, right? You enjoy it?
So I enjoy it, but it's honestly hard because the questions and the decisions you have to make are not that black and white, right? Let's say you write something server side, right? You write some database statements, whatever. You write a test for it. You get this nice gratification. The test is green. It's working. It's fast. Whatever. This is somehow very objectively correct. Whereas as a manager, this is often missing. You have this idea, let's try this, let's try that, but you don't know whether it's the right thing. Is this correct? I have a gut feeling, but I also don't have any past experience that I could pull from, right? So I can talk to people and get their opinion, but I don't know upfront, is this correct? And is this now the right thing to do at this very moment? Or should I wait for a week with that? Are we at the right stage? Did I overlook something? So there's like so many things. And yes, programming on the evening and weekend is just like, feels easier to me, right, personally. But I know that at the stage that we're in, right, I need to spend more time on the organization, on how we are working, on the processes, on the product, figuring that out, enabling others, training them, which is also pretty hard when you're constantly pulled in so many directions. Um, it's fun, but it's honestly also a challenge.
No, absolutely. It's much more emotional also, right? If you work with people,
Yes.
as you said, right? There's no unit test for a lot of things, right? It's
Yeah.
it's a lot of emotion.
And also what's working for one person is not working for the next, right?
Exactly. It's also triggering emotions in yourself. It's like things that sometimes hard decisions, sometimes you say something that somebody totally receives differently than you have sent the message, right? So it's a very interesting thing. And I think it's interesting to share that. I mean, I was an engineer myself when I turned into a CEO, built a company, and I'm still struggling with it. I mean, I'm doing that for 20 years. And sometimes you come to me and say, hey, do you have a good advice? And I'm like, I can just
It
tell you,
really isn't easy.
it's not easy, right? There is no easy, here's the solution, do that unit test or use this API and the problem is solved, right? And productivity at the end also, right? How do you make sure, yes, you can program it overnight maybe and fix the problem, but at one scale you can't do it anymore, right? Then you have to figure out how to get the team productive and make it even much more productive than I don't know, 5 bands. And that's a really big challenge. That's hard to do, but I think it's fun to do. And it's a great challenge. And we are growing fast. That's even more challenging, right? If you have to hire in parallel, that's also a complicated task, right? To hire the right people. I like that you're enjoying it. You do a great job. I really enjoy watching you doing that over the past months, and it's amazing how well it works. But
Thank
I
you.
also see that it's not easy.
It absolutely isn't. It's constant learning, honestly speaking. And it also gives me an appreciation of my previous managers, right? Everything they had to do that I wasn't aware of, right? That's because that's also reality. As an individual contributor, there's like so many things that you have no idea are happening behind the scenes. So many discussions, so many individual problems that you're not aware of. And I now appreciate a lot of people a lot more, I can tell you.
It's essentially a lot of code red moments, right? A little code red, which you have in that thing. So
Yeah.
like your first technical one. So Ben, was awesome talking to you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Same here, Mirko. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. I'm always sharing new insights and insider knowledge about observability on LinkedIn. You can follow me there for more. The podcast is produced by Dash0. We make observability easy for every developer.